Welcome to DLS's Instructor Training Series. Today's session will be on giving effective feedback, going beyond error correction. Let's get started. This session is the third in a three-part series. The first session covered setting goals using can-do statements. The second section was on measuring student progress. And then today's session, the third session, will be on giving feedback to students. Here's what we'll cover in this session. What do we give feedback on? How should we give feedback? And then how should we give specific feedback that our students will understand? And then finally, we'll wrap up by talking about how we can get students to self-assess. As we know, there are many types of feedback that we can give, but this session is going to focus specifically on giving feedback for communicative speaking activities that are done with students. So it's focused just on speaking, not really on listening or reading, and it's on communicative activities. This session is not focused on progress report writing or writing formal assessments. That will be covered in a different session. So what do we give feedback on? Now, when we talk about giving feedback on communicative speaking activities in our classes, we want to remember that we give feedback on students' progress towards their learning goals. So setting specific, achievable goals is already a start in the feedback process, because once you set goals, the student can begin to think about their progress towards those goals. And then feedback is the next step of that process. So what do you think about this quotation below? It's not teaching that causes learning. Learning is caused by learners attempting to do something and getting feedback on the attempt. Do you agree with this quotation? This quotation has a lot of implications for how we plan and prepare for our classes. And one foundational aspect of proficiency-based learning is that students have to do things or attempt to do things in the target language. And often in our planning, we might spend a lot of time planning about what we will teach, but we should also remember to plan for what the students will do and how we'll give feedback once they do something. So, as we said a moment ago, feedback starts with setting goals. What is an example of learning goal? Here's an example for an ILR Level 2 student. I can handle a transaction with a complication. To see a longer list of goals by proficiency level, check out the DLS can-do statements. You can find these on Moodle. Once we have a goal, the next thing we need to do is design a task so that we can check to see whether or not students can do that goal. So the goal is a bit more broad, whereas the task is more specific. Now, for this learning goal, there are many tasks that we could design. A transaction with a complication. We could say that the student returns an item of clothing that they bought to a store. Or maybe they have to send back the food they ordered at a restaurant. Or maybe they have to call an online company and tell them that they want to return something that they bought online. There are lots of different tasks that you could design for this goal. This is one example. Once we've set goals and designed a task, our next step is to assess the student and see if they can do the task. So for this task, returning an item of clothing, probably the best way to assess would be a role play, where the teacher takes one role and the student takes another. Or if you have multiple students, the students can role play together. And then, Having set goals, designed a task, and assessed the goal, our next step is feedback and reflection. So let's take a look at that now. Now that we've seen where feedback fits into the learning cycle, let's talk about what kind of feedback we should give. So after we've done a communicative speaking activity with students, we want to give them feedback on it. And that feedback should be specific. So it should be precise enough that it's easy for the student to understand. It should be immediate. So we should give the feedback as soon as possible after the speaking activity. Maybe it won't be possible to give it right afterwards, but we should give it as soon as we can. The feedback can be spoken or written, or both, depending on what's best for you or what's best for your student, or maybe what's required by your agency. The feedback should be balanced, so it should have both good things and bad things. And as we saw earlier, it should be relevant to the learning goals. So whatever learning goal the student was trying to accomplish, for example, handling a transaction with a complication, the feedback should mention or be relevant to that learning goal. So if you're like me, when I was a teacher, I always found that giving feedback could be very time consuming and sometimes it could be difficult. And of course, we want to make things easy on ourselves. So one way to make the process of giving feedback a little bit more efficient and a bit easier on us is to use a rubric. And what is a rubric? A rubric is a way to assess students' performance, and in this case, students' speaking performance. So here's an example rubric, and you can see that it has a set of criteria at the top: fluency, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation. It has assessment. You can see that here. Exceeds expectations, meets expectations, sometimes meets and doesn't meet expectations. And then finally, it has a place for the teacher to comment. Below, you can see the DLS rubric for speaking. And you can see that there are guiding questions for each category. But as you can see, the questions are mixed up. So take a moment, pause the video, and match the questions to the appropriate category. Okay, great. Now check your answers and see how many you got right. So here you can see the guiding questions for each category, for each criterion. And you can also see that you have a way to rate the students. So you can rate them as exceeds expectations, meets, sometimes meets, or doesn't meet. Now that we've talked about the criteria and rating the students, let's talk next about commenting. So when we write comments on a rubric, we want to follow our guidelines for giving feedback to students. So the comments, the feedback that we give here should be specific and actionable. And we should think about the question, will the student be able to take this feedback and know what to work on? So will it be specific enough that the student can say, oh, okay, now I know what I should go and work on? We should also make sure that the feedback, the comments we give, are relative to the student's learning goals. So instead of just saying, oh, you need to work on your vocabulary, that's very broad, we can say something that's related to the learning goal. So maybe if the student is ordering food in a restaurant, maybe that's the goal, we can say you need to work on your food vocabulary because you had some gaps there. And we always want to try to show the relationship between their performance, between what the student did, and the can-do statement. So now Let's take a look at some bad examples and some good examples of ways to comment on students' grammar and vocabulary. So take a look at the comments on the left and let's look at them. So the first comment, you need more vocabulary. This comment is pretty vague. It's very general. And the student might get this comment and think, well, what do I do? What do I work on next? So here's a way to make the comment more specific. Work on your travel vocabulary. And here the teacher has written down some mistakes the student made. Go with plane, go with car, along with the corrections. And if the student gets this comment, then they can go and they can study travel vocabulary. That's pretty actionable. Now let's look at the grammar comment. The teacher has said, here are your grammar mistakes. I goed, I didn't went. So this comment is a little bit more specific, but let's look at a way we could make it better. So here, the teacher has taken the specific examples and has said the grammar point. So the teacher says, you need to work on the simple past. So that way the student can go and look that up and study it. The teacher has also written down the mistakes and the corrections. And this is an important point. Research has shown that the most effective way to do error correction is if the student can correct the error. So the ideal way for this to go would be for the teacher to write the mistake, show the student the mistake after the speaking task, and then ask the student to correct it and see if the student can correct it themselves. And then once the student corrects it, it's really important that after that, the student sees and hears the corrected form. So what the teacher should do is write down the corrected form in the target language and then say the corrected form, just so that the student has that extra reinforcement. All right, and let's look at the last comment here on vocabulary again. So here the teacher has given a positive comment. Your vocabulary is pretty good. But again, this is very vague. It's very general. So let's look at a way to make it better. So here, the teacher has said that the student has a good vocabulary for discussing daily routines and has given some examples to show that the variety that the student has. So this is helpful because this is more specific. Now, let's look at some bad examples and some good examples for commenting on students' fluency. So on the left, let's look at the first comment. Your fluency was good. So this is a very general comment. It's not very specific. Let's compare it to this one. You had several memorized phrases for making requests. So then the teacher writes some specific examples. Can you, would you mind, is it okay if? These really helped your fluency. So here the teacher is making a positive comment and pointing out specifically what the student is doing well. So this positive comment is much more specific and it can really help the student to see what they're doing well, a successful strategy, so that they can work on improving that strategy and getting better for the next time. Now let's look at the second comment. This is a negative comment, so your fluency was pretty bad. So here the student might not know what to work on. It's not very actionable or specific. And here is a more specific example. So the teacher has said that the student needs to connect their sentences, and they're giving some examples of connectors that the student could use, like then, after that, next. And connectors are really important for fluency, so the teacher's giving a really specific suggestion here. Here's another suggestion that we might give for fluency. So this is something we might see with a level 1 student or a 0 plus. You spoke mostly in phrases. Try speaking in full sentences because that will have a really big impact on their fluency. And then here we can see the phrase, the comment, you spoke really slowly. This is a little bit more specific, but it's not very actionable. If the student gets that comment, they might not know what to do to work on that. So here's another way to give a more specific and actionable comment. So the teacher points out you had a lot of unfilled pauses. Try learning some filler words in the target language. For example, actually, well, the thing is. So here, again, the teacher is pointing out a specific problem, unfilled pauses, and giving a suggestion. Now, let's look at some ways to comment on task achievement. And remember when we say task achievement, we're talking about the task that we gave students to do. So for example, returning an item of clothing to the store, or ordering food in a restaurant, or describing their plans for the weekend, or talking about their last vacation, etc., etc. So here are some examples of comments that are a bit vague, maybe not very helpful. You met the goal of the task, you didn't meet the goal. So let's look at some more specific comments. So here the teacher gives balanced feedback, saying the student met the goal, but pointing out something that they can do to get to the next level. So saying that the student's responses were short, which is a common problem with students, and that the next time they should give responses with more details and more explanations. Here's another example. So in this case, it looks like the student misunderstood the teacher or maybe answered the wrong question, which happens sometimes. So here the teacher is pointing that out and giving them a strategy to use for the next time. So the next time, if the student doesn't understand the question, instead of guessing, they should repeat or paraphrase what the teacher has said to make sure they understand. And this is a great strategy. And then here's a final comment. So this is for a role play. And here it looks like the student asked some questions, but in order to really fully achieve the task, they needed to ask more questions, maybe with more follow-up questions. All right, and then finally we come to pronunciation. So here we can see on the left, we have some comments that are pretty vague and maybe not very helpful for the students. Your pronunciation was terrible, great, I couldn't understand you. So let's look at some more specific comments. So here, the teacher has pointed out a pattern of error. So it looks like the student, instead of saying yes, is saying yes with like a J sound. So the teacher is pointing that out and will probably model the correct sound for the student and help them to produce it. Here the teacher is pointing out an area where the student has improved, which is great feedback to give. That can be really encouraging for a student. And then here, the teacher notes that there was one part that she couldn't understand, but she's specific about it. So here she says, I couldn't understand you when you talked about, and X could be anything, when you talked about your plans for the weekend, or I couldn't understand you when you said what you do in the morning. And she's giving a bit more of a specific feedback about when she couldn't understand. Now, take a moment and write down a few notes using the rubric here. Now let's try with a level 1 student. So imagine that this is your student. Her task is to describe a typical day. Imagine that the student is in your class, you watch her complete this speaking activity, and you want to give her feedback using the rubric. Let's watch.
And so tell me, Guadalupe, what do you do in Yonkers? What's a daily, a typical day like for you?
I get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I prepare my kids to be ready to go to school. And when they went to school, I I go to school for hours to learn English every day, Monday through Friday. And when I come back from my school, I prepare the lunch for my kids, clean my apartment, and in the afternoon I have to help my kids with their homework.
And when you're not helping others and going to school yourself, what other kinds of things do you enjoy doing in your free time?
I like to watch the news on television, read books with my daughters because one daughter, she likes to read a lot of books.
And so what kinds of books does she like to read?
She reads books about animals, about flowers. She loves to read different kinds of books.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yes.
Now, take a moment and write down a few notes using the rubric here. Now let's look at some feedback that we might give to this student. And keep in mind, this is just one example of feedback that we might give. So you may have written something different, and that is totally fine as long as the feedback is specific, actionable, balanced, and relative to the learning goals. So let's start with task completion. And remember, the student's task here was to describe a typical day. And I think we can say that she definitely did that. After listening to the student, we have a pretty good idea of what her regular day is like. So we can see the positive comments in green, and then the negative comments or the points to work on, those are in purple. So the student answered all of the questions, and on some questions, on some answers, she gave details, which is really great. I think the point for this student to work on is that sometimes the teacher had to ask her to elaborate. So, oh, what kind of books does your daughter like to read? And I think for this student, she should work on giving long answers so that the teacher doesn't have to ask her those follow-up questions, that she can just keep talking. So that would be the thing I would tell that student. For fluency, this student used when as a connector word. She used that quite frequently, which is great. She also seemed to speak pretty easily, and there weren't a lot of long pauses. One thing that the student could definitely do is add more connectors. So things like then, after that, next, etc. That would be a really good point for her fluency. For the student's grammar, she had a lot of accurate grammar usage. She used the present simple, first and third person, with pretty reliable accuracy, and she even had some more complex structures like I have to and I like to. There were one or two times when the student used the past tense when she should have used the present tense, so we might comment on that. For vocabulary, the student had a really good variety when she was talking about daily routines. So she said, get up, go to school, clean, watch the news, read books. So that's really great. One thing is that she did overuse the word prepare a little bit and used it in a way that's a little bit unnatural for English. So instead of saying prepare lunch, we would probably say make lunch. And instead of saying prepare my kids for school, we'd probably say get my kids ready to go to school. For pronunciation, we can definitely say that she meets expectations. It was pretty easy to understand everything that she said. There are several points that this student could work on. One of them is the short I sound. So kids and with. She pronounces that sound a bit longer than she should. And then our final student is a level 2+, and his task is to compare and contrast Korean and American universities. So once again, imagine this is your student. Let's watch the video and be prepared to give the student feedback using the rubric.
You studied in a Korean university and you studied in an American university. Can you compare and contrast the two systems for me? What were similar and what were some of the things that were different?
Let me speak about difference first.
Mm-hmm.
In universities in Korea, the major department is very tight.
Mm-hmm.
The student relationship is very tight, especially for the same year,
Mm-hmm.
same grade student. They're very tight.
Mm-hmm.
So we all know each other,
Mm-hmm.
and we eat together.
Mm-hmm.
We travel together. We do a lot of things together.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a small group is very tight until they graduate.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, people do not change their major or school.
Mm-hmm.
So they stay together for a very long time.
Mm.
On the other hand, American universities, they can change, they take courses from other major departments, especially from like a third year or fourth year. They change all over they change to the double major, to change their major, change their school, transfer to another school. It's very easy here. Transferring school in Korea is very difficult. You basically have to take the entrance exam again. But and it's why I was in there.
So it's not very flexible.
Not
Now, take a moment and write down a few notes using the rubric here. Now, let's look at some example feedback we might give the student. And again, keeping in mind that this is just one example and you may have given different feedback, and that's totally fine. So for task completion, I think we can say that yes, the student has met expectations. He did a great job talking about the differences, and he gave examples and details, which was really good. The student did not mention the similarities here. So we can say that he meets expectations, but maybe put him a bit on the lower end. And also a few more examples of how American schools are flexible would be more helpful. So he mentioned changing majors a few times. It was a little bit repetitive, so maybe a few different examples would be good. For fluency, we have some positive comments here. So the student did a great job signposting, saying, oh, let me speak about the differences first. Well, on the other hand, it had nice transitions there. He spoke with ease, and there weren't really any long pauses. For grammar, the grammar that the student chose for this task was appropriate, and it was correct. One pattern of error that we did see was that he had a problem with articles. So we heard him say, I will speak about difference first instead of the differences, and he left off the A for a very long time. For vocabulary, we're rating him as sometimes meets expectations. So the student had a very good variety of academic and school vocabulary, double major, transfer schools, etc. But we did hear some repetitive vocabulary, and particularly the word tight. He repeated this word a few times, and it's not really accurate. We should use the word close to describe relationships. Their relationships are very close. And also, we don't really want to hear a lot of repetitive vocabulary from a student at this level. We want to hear more of a variety. So that could be our advice to the student, is to work on his vocabulary for describing relationships. For pronunciation, we could understand everything that the student says. We do have a few things for him to work on. So we can see the R sound at the end of words. And then also the S sound at the end of words. So working on producing these two sounds when they come at the end of words. Now, during the speaking activities from the last section, we focused a lot on the students and what they were doing. But now let's think about what a teacher should be doing during a speaking activity. So think back to the previous videos we watched, and of course, let's imagine that those are speaking activities that we would do in a class with our students. And so think about the teachers in those sample videos. And take a moment and write 2 things that you think a teacher should do during a speaking activity, and 2 things that they shouldn't do. So, what should a teacher do during a speaking activity? The most important thing is to make sure the student gets long speaking turns. So we want the student to speak as much as they can. With the lower proficiency levels, 0+ and 1, the teacher asked several questions. But with the higher level student, the teacher really only asked one question, and then the student spoke. One thing we don't want to do is interrupt the student. We want to let them continue talking as much as they can. We also want to take notes. This is really helpful so that we can note down what we are noticing about the student's fluency, about their vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, etc. We don't want to help the student. So if the student can't find the right word, or if they take a moment to think about what they're saying, we want to give them that moment. So if they really can't say anything, then we can ask a follow-up question, but we want to make sure that we give them a chance. And if they can't find the right word, then we want to let them find another word that has a similar meaning. And then finally, one great thing to do during a speaking activity is to record the activity. That way you can listen to it later and your student can listen to it later. And then one thing we should not do is correct errors in the moment. So even if we hear the student making mistakes, which of course we will, we want to note those mistakes down and then find some patterns that we can correct afterwards. And how often should we give feedback like this to our students? Feedback should be regular. So whenever students complete a speaking activity that's related to the can-do statements, they should get feedback on it. So let's remember that this kind of speaking activity is going to come at the end of a cycle. So the first thing we do is we set a goal using the can-do statement. We design a task, then we assess the goal, and then we have feedback. So if you are previewing a unit of study with your student, maybe looking at your textbook, or if you're creating a unit of study, maybe with authentic materials, you might set can-do statements and then assess them maybe on a weekly basis, depending on how intensive your class is, or maybe every other week. But it should be on a regular basis that students have a chance to complete a speaking activity related to the can-do statements and get feedback on it. Now, if you have a group class, you might not want to give feedback to the students in front of the group. Maybe you do if your students are comfortable with this, but if they're not comfortable with it, then you have a few options. Remember that feedback can be written or spoken. So if you have a group class, you can give students spoken feedback in individual breakout rooms. So send each of your students to a breakout room, give them a task, and then you can join the breakout rooms one by one and give them their feedback. If you're not sure how to do this on Zoom, just ask your LTS. Another option is to give the students written feedback after class. In our final section, we'll talk about self-assessment. So we've talked a lot about the teacher giving feedback to the student, but it's also important to ask the students to assess themselves. And the reason is that accurate self-assessment is key for learner autonomy, for the student becoming a more autonomous and independent learner. Now, at the beginning, when you ask them to assess themselves, students probably won't be able to do this very accurately. But self-assessment is one thing that gets better with practice. So as students have regular opportunities to assess themselves, they will hopefully become more and more accurate the more practice they get. It's a good idea to ask students to self-assess before giving them your feedback, because this will prompt them to really reflect and think about how they did. And to help students self-assess, you can start off with simple questions, especially at the beginning. So you might ask something like, was that speaking task easy or difficult? What parts were easy or difficult? And this might prompt the student to think about, oh, this part was difficult, I didn't have enough vocabulary. You might also ask, what do you think you did well? What do you think needs improvement? And then once the student has more experience with self-assessment, you can even give them the speaking rubric and ask them to rate themselves before comparing their assessment with your assessment and feedback. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with your LTS.